What happens when an entire military alliance surrounds Russia's most guarded fortress in a single morning, and Moscow can't do a thing about it? Before we dive into this, hit like if you want more breakdowns like this one, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next in this standoff, and share this with someone who still thinks this war is only happening in Ukraine. It isn't. It's spreading north into the Baltic, and what happened there recently might be one of the most important military moments of this entire year. Let's get into it. On the morning of August 18th, something unusual happened in the skies above Kaliningrad, Russia's only ice-free port in the Baltic Sea and home to its entire Baltic fleet. More than 50 NATO aircraft appeared in the region almost simultaneously, effectively wrapping Putin's most heavily defended outpost in a blanket of surveillance, jamming, and raw air power. This wasn't a routine patrol, and it wasn't the kind of thing that happens by accident. This was fifth-generation stealth fighters, advanced electronic warfare planes, intelligence-gathering aircraft, and refueling tankers, all converging on one small, isolated piece of Russian territory at the exact same time, in broad daylight, for anyone watching to see. And it wasn't just in the air. On the ground, Polish forces moved into position, tightening what was quickly starting to look like an actual encirclement rather than a simple show of strength meant only for photographs. The message being sent to Moscow that morning was about as clear as messages get in modern military signaling. We see everything you do. We hear everything you say. And we can be here faster than you can react, no matter how well you think you've prepared. So what actually happened up there, and why does it matter so much beyond a single dramatic headline? Let's break down exactly how this operation unfolded piece by piece, because the details reveal something much bigger than a single morning of tension between two rival powers. This massive air campaign, backed by the United States, Norway, Poland, and Italy, moved with a level of coordination that clearly took months to plan and rehearse behind closed doors, far from public view until it was too late to hide. An airborne command center was set up over northern Poland, effectively becoming the nerve center for everything happening in the skies nearby that day. A NATO surveillance aircraft, functioning almost like a flying air traffic control tower for military operations, managed the entire airspace from a single point, coordinating dozens of aircraft in real time without a single miscommunication slipping through the cracks. But the piece of this puzzle that really stood out, the one that should genuinely concern anyone watching this closely and understanding what it actually represents, was a specific American electronic warfare aircraft. It had been pulled directly from active operations in the Middle East and flown straight to a Polish airbase for this mission, a redeployment that alone signals how seriously this was being taken at the highest levels of command. Once there, it flew a continuous 2-hour circuit just west of Kaliningrad, and its job wasn't simply to listen in on Russian communications from a safe distance and record what it heard. This aircraft can, if needed, blind and deafen enemy radar and communication systems entirely, effectively silencing an adversary's ability to see or speak electronically at the exact moment it matters most. For those 2 hours, Russia's Baltic Fleet headquarters likely experienced serious disruption to its own internal communications, not because anyone fired a single shot or crossed a single physical border, but because this aircraft is essentially a flying cyber warfare platform capable of reaching directly into enemy networks and shutting them down from the inside, quietly and without warning, like a burglar who never needs to break a window. At the exact same time, a separate American intelligence aircraft was quietly vacuuming up every electronic signal in the region, cataloging Russian troop movements, radar activity, and communications with a level of detail that would have been almost unthinkable just a decade earlier. This aircraft could detect even minor Russian armored vehicle movements on the ground and log them instantly into a shared intelligence database accessible across the entire operation, turning scattered signals into one unified, constantly updating picture of the battlefield. Layer on top of that a squadron of American and Norwegian stealth fighters conducting patrols nearby, and you start to see the true shape of what this operation actually was underneath all the surface-level drama that made headlines. These jets weren't simply there to look intimidating from the ground or make for dramatic footage. Modern stealth fighters function as flying data processing centers, mapping every gap and blind spot in Russian radar coverage in real time, building a constantly updating picture of Kaliningrad's defenses that refreshes every few seconds without pause, second by second, mile by mile. Keeping an operation like this running smoothly for hours requires serious logistical support behind the scenes, support that rarely gets discussed but makes everything else possible. NATO brought exactly that. Multiple aerial refueling tankers from the United States, Italy, and NATO's own combined fleet kept the fighters in the air continuously, without a single one needing to return to base and break the pattern that was being so carefully maintained. Polish airspace, for that entire stretch of time, saw a level of military air traffic it genuinely hadn't experienced in years, maybe not since the early days of the Alliance's eastward expansion. But this wasn't only happening over land, and that's the part many casual observers missed entirely in the initial coverage. Further north, a different kind of pursuit was quietly playing out on and beneath the water, far from the cameras focused on Kaliningrad itself and the drama unfolding there. A British maritime patrol aircraft and a German naval reconnaissance plane spent hours circling a specific stretch of water between Denmark and Norway, an area known as the Skagerrak Strait. This narrow passage happens to be the only realistic route Russian submarines can use to enter or exit the Baltic Sea, which makes it an extremely important choke point to monitor closely, especially during a period of heightened tension like this one, when every movement matters. These aircraft dropped sonar buoys across the seabed, essentially placing an underwater microphone network across the entire strait, listening for anything moving beneath the surface that shouldn't be there, anything trying to slip through unnoticed. Whatever they were tracking, and it's not hard to guess given everything else happening that particular week, they were clearly following something specific and deliberate, not conducting a routine training exercise. Piece by piece, it became obvious that NATO wasn't just watching Kaliningrad from above. It was quietly boxing in Russian naval movement from much further north as well, closing off options Moscow may not have even realized were being closed until it was already too late to respond. So why did all of this happen now, specifically on this particular morning, rather than any other day this year? The answer isn't random timing, and it isn't coincidence either, no matter how it might have looked to casual observers scrolling through headlines. It connects to a much larger strategic plan that had reportedly leaked to German media in the weeks before this operation took place, giving the world a preview of what was coming. That plan outlines a three-phase concept for how NATO would respond to any Russian aggression in the region, and it's about as direct as military planning documents ever get in public view, leaving little room for ambiguity. The first phase focuses on immediately neutralizing Russian air defense and missile systems around Kaliningrad in the opening moments of any conflict, using intense electronic warfare combined with precision-guided weapons designed to work in tandem from the very first second. The specific targets named include Russia's long-range ballistic missile batteries and its advanced air defense radar systems, the exact weapons that would otherwise prevent NATO aircraft from safely operating anywhere near Kaliningrad in the first place, making them the obvious opening priority in any real scenario. The second phase shifts the focus almost entirely to unmanned systems along the borders with Russia and Belarus, essentially creating a heavily automated buffer zone where drones, robotic ground systems, and AI-powered surveillance would respond to any incursion instantly, without waiting for slower human decision-making to catch up with events unfolding in real time on the ground. It's a vision of warfare where machines, not soldiers, form the first line of contact. The third and most aggressive phase involves striking deep inside Russian territory itself, targeting military factories, transport infrastructure, and airfields used by strategic bombers, using special forces and long-range precision weapons capable of reaching far beyond the immediate front line and into the Russian interior. The goal isn't invasion, and it's worth being clear about that distinction because it changes how you should read everything else in this plan. It's something narrower, and in some ways more calculated and patient. Trap the Russian military inside its own borders and strip away its ability to project force outward at all, region by region, until the option simply no longer exists in any practical sense. If you're starting to see just how deliberately this entire situation has been engineered over months of careful planning, that's exactly why this story deserves more attention than it's currently getting in most mainstream coverage. Drop a comment letting me know what surprised you most so far, because this next part is where things get genuinely tense and considerably more dangerous than anything we've covered up to this point. But the more alarming development happened far beneath the surface, away from any camera or satellite that could easily track it in real time. Russia's long secretive nuclear-powered submarine, the one defense analysts have nicknamed the Doomsday submarine, put to sea for what appears to be an operational deployment rather than a routine test cruise. Unlike a typical attack submarine built for conventional naval engagements against other ships, this vessel was purpose-built to carry a set of nuclear-armed underwater drones with intercontinental range, weapons designed to travel silently along the ocean floor for extended periods, sometimes days at a time, before ever reaching a target thousands of miles from where they launched. The timing here matters enormously, and it's not something analysts believe happened purely by chance or coincidence. Just days before this submarine deployment, Ukrainian forces carried out a surprise strike on a Russian naval base, severely damaging several warships and delivering a genuine shock to Russian military leadership watching from Moscow, forcing an uncomfortable reassessment of naval security. With its prestige in the Black Sea visibly dented by that attack, sending its most terrifying weapon into the Baltic looks a lot like an attempt to restore that lost sense of intimidation through raw nuclear signaling aimed squarely at a nervous European audience already on edge. These underwater drones, each roughly the size of a school bus, are designed to approach coastal targets undetected, without following the predictable arc of a traditional ballistic missile that air defense systems are specifically built to track and intercept. If even one ever reached a populated coastal area anywhere in Europe, the consequences would be genuinely catastrophic, both physically and psychologically, in ways that are difficult to fully calculate in advance. By bringing a weapon like this into open testing and visible deployment, Russia is playing its most extreme card available, nuclear deterrence, aimed squarely at reminding NATO exactly what's at stake if this standoff continues to escalate further than either side currently intends. So where does this actually leave the region now that both sides have shown their hand so openly in a way that's difficult to quietly walk back or pretend didn't happen? Kaliningrad occupies a strange position that's almost the mirror image of West Berlin during the Cold War, and that comparison isn't accidental among historians and analysts studying this specific region closely. For Russia, it's a forward military outpost, a projection of power driven straight into the heart of Europe, meant to intimidate and remind neighboring countries of Moscow's continued reach and relevance. But NATO's recent demonstration made something uncomfortably clear to anyone paying close attention to how this all unfolded. Kaliningrad is also Russia's greatest vulnerability, hiding in plain sight the entire time, disguised as a symbol of strength. On a map, it looks like a powerful forward position bristling with weapons and defended by layers of air defense. In practical, logistical terms, it's an isolated pocket that could become completely paralyzed the moment a real conflict actually began, regardless of how well armed it appears. If serious fighting broke out, Kaliningrad would effectively become an isolated island, cut off by land and surrounded on every other side, without any realistic path to reinforcement from the Russian mainland. Its only physical connection to the rest of Russian-controlled territory runs through a narrow strip of land called the Suwałki Corridor, squeezed uncomfortably between Lithuania and Poland, barely wide enough to matter on most maps. If NATO ever sealed that corridor during a genuine crisis, the roughly 1 million residents living in Kaliningrad, along with tens of thousands of stationed troops, would find themselves in a genuine logistical dead end with nowhere left to turn and no realistic way out. NATO has already taken meaningful steps toward this kind of isolation over recent years, quietly and methodically, without much fanfare at the time. With Finland and Sweden joining the alliance, the entire Baltic Sea has effectively become NATO-controlled water, making any realistic resupply of Kaliningrad by sea extremely difficult for Russia to sustain over any meaningful length of time without significant risk. And earlier this year, the Baltic states fully disconnected from Russia's electrical grid, a quiet but significant step that already began isolating Kaliningrad in ways that don't require a single military engagement to accomplish, proving that isolation doesn't always need to come from the barrel of a gun. Right now, Kaliningrad looks less like an aggressive forward base and more like a fortress surrounded on every side, forced to rely entirely on its own limited resources for everything from energy to military logistics, with fewer options available every single month that passes. Looking ahead, we're probably not heading toward a sudden hot war in this specific region, at least not immediately or without significant additional provocation. What's more likely is a prolonged, gradually intensifying standoff, the kind analysts often call gray zone competition, where neither side commits to open conflict, but neither backs down either, each testing the other's resolve in smaller, calculated increments. But there's no real guarantee Putin will simply accept being boxed in without some kind of visible response of his own, given his track record throughout this entire war. Expect louder nuclear rhetoric coming out of Kaliningrad in the coming weeks, more frequent missile exercises designed to draw attention and reassert relevance, and continued GPS jamming aimed at civilian aircraft flying over the Baltic, something Russia has already been doing for months using powerful signal jammers based in the region. That kind of low-level electronic harassment functions almost like a stress test, probing NATO's patience and measuring exactly how the alliance responds under sustained, deliberate pressure applied gradually over time. NATO, in turn, will likely continue shifting more armored units and air defense systems into the region, specifically to shore up the vulnerability around the Suwałki Corridor, treating it as the priority weak point it clearly is in any realistic scenario. But the most consequential battles happening right now aren't visible at all to the naked eye, or even to most conventional sensors. They're taking place entirely in the electromagnetic spectrum, invisible to anyone without specialized equipment and technical expertise. With that electronic warfare aircraft now flying operational missions near Kaliningrad, Russian electronic warfare units that had spent years operating freely in Baltic airspace suddenly find themselves being hunted instead of hunting. A genuine reversal of roles nobody in Moscow expected this soon or this openly. That shift alone tells you NATO has moved into a noticeably higher gear when it comes to electronic warfare capability and confidence in using it. What all of this really demonstrates, when you step back and look at the complete picture, rather than any single dramatic moment, is that modern conflict has moved well beyond tanks and artillery rolling across open fields, the way previous generations understood warfare. It's increasingly being fought through invisible signals, radar jamming, and network intrusion, and whichever side ultimately controls that invisible battlefield may end up controlling the entire region without ever needing to fire a shot in anger or cross a single visible line. There's also a heavy economic dimension to all of this that rarely gets discussed alongside the more dramatic military details that dominate the headlines. Russian cargo ships attempting to reach Kaliningrad by sea now operate under constant, uncomfortable surveillance from NATO warships and patrol aircraft throughout the Baltic, every single voyage tracked from departure to arrival without exception. Even Russia's so-called shadow fleet, the vessels used to quietly circumvent international sanctions and keep essential trade flowing, can't easily escape the reach of advanced maritime patrol aircraft constantly sweeping the region day and night, regardless of the routes they attempt to take. While Putin leans on submarines and hypersonic weapons to project fear and dominate international headlines, NATO is quietly tightening a much less dramatic but arguably far more effective form of pressure using surveillance, data, and coordinated technology that never makes for a dramatic photo but accomplishes just as much, if not more. This encirclement may only be the opening stage of a much longer strategy aimed at steadily reducing Russia's room to maneuver anywhere in the Baltic region over the coming years, not months. Kaliningrad, once viewed as Russia's aggressive fist extended into Europe, is gradually turning into a position that's becoming genuinely difficult to defend under any realistic scenario military planners might imagine. No matter which asymmetric options Putin explores to try breaking out of this isolation, basic geography keeps working against him in ways that are exceptionally hard to overcome through military means alone, no matter how advanced his weapon systems become. There's one more layer to this story worth understanding clearly because it stretches well beyond Europe and touches an entirely different part of the world that most coverage overlooks entirely. This entire show of force wasn't only a message aimed at Moscow, even though that was clearly the primary audience for the operation. It was also, quite deliberately, a message aimed at Beijing, watching carefully from thousands of miles away, with its own strategic calculations to make. China's own long-term ambitions in the Indo-Pacific region depend heavily on understanding exactly how unified and decisive Western military coordination can actually be when genuinely tested under real-world pressure, rather than in theoretical planning documents. Watching how quickly and systematically NATO can technologically box in one of Russia's most protected regions offers Chinese leadership a fairly clear preview of what genuine allied cohesion actually looks like when it's fully activated and coordinated across multiple countries and domains simultaneously. And this demonstration wasn't limited to sea level or airspace either, which is easy to overlook if you're only watching the fighter jets and missing the bigger picture unfolding above them. Throughout the operation, NATO integrated data collected from military satellites in orbit, alongside everything happening in the air and at sea simultaneously, showing a level of coordinated capability that spans from outer space down to the ocean floor without any obvious gaps for an adversary to exploit. Combining space-based intelligence, cyber operations, and traditional air power into one seamless operational picture creates an overwhelming effect on any opposing command structure trying desperately to keep up with the sheer volume and speed of information being processed. This kind of integrated, networked approach shows that the alliance isn't only defending physical borders anymore in the traditional sense that previous generations would recognize. It's actively contesting the invisible battle spaces that will likely define every future conflict going forward, whether in Europe or anywhere else on the globe. So where does all of this actually leave us, after walking through every layer of what happened that morning and everything it connects to? What happened over Kaliningrad on August 18th wasn't a routine training exercise, and treating it as one would badly misread its significance and the message it was clearly designed to send. It was one of the clearer signals yet that the balance of power in this region is shifting, carefully, deliberately, and mostly without a single shot fired in anger by either side. NATO used technology and coordination to remind Moscow exactly where the real boundaries sit, boundaries that had perhaps started to feel a little too flexible in recent years of steadily rising tension. And no matter how unsettling Russia's hypersonic weapons or its Doomsday submarine might genuinely be to contemplate from a civilian perspective, the ability to react instantly and dominate an entire region electronically is quietly reshaping who actually holds the real advantage here, regardless of who holds the flashier, more headline-grabbing weapons. The Baltic has become one of the most dangerous fault lines on the planet right now, precisely because neither side appears willing to step back first and risk looking weak in front of a watching world. The open question left hanging over everything is simple to state, even if the answer isn't simple to predict with any real confidence. Will Russia quietly accept that its most protected outpost has effectively been surrounded and neutralized without firing a shot in response? Or will Putin push back harder, testing the limits of just how far this standoff can go before something finally breaks under the accumulated pressure of months of escalation? Either way, what happens next in Kaliningrad may end up telling us far more about the future of this entire conflict than anything currently happening on the ground in Ukraine. And it's worth watching closely, because this particular fault line isn't going away anytime soon, no matter how this current chapter ends.